The Walker first showed Sherman's work here in 1982, from which we purchased our first work. We then presented a show of her history portraits here in 1991. Sherman's work has been a lively presentation, or lively presence in presentations of our permanent collection ever since, most recently being handpicked by John Waters as part of a show he curated from the Walker's holdings. The show you see in the Target and Friedman galleries upstairs encompasses 30 years of Sherman's remarkable career. I want to take a moment to acknowledge those who have made the Walker's presentation possible. For their key support, we're grateful to Martha and Bruce Atwater, the Broad Art Foundation, Marilyn and Larry Fields, Karen and Ken Hightoff, Elizabeth Redleaf, and John L. Thompson. I'm also very pleased to acknowledge our media partner, Minneapolis St. Paul Magazine, and our hotel partners, Le Meridian Chambers and W Minneapolis, the Fauché. Today's opening program, Cindy Sherman from Four Sides, is made possible by the generous support of Carol and Aaron Mack. Artists from a wide array of disciplines continue to find layers of meaning and complexity in Cindy Sherman's work. This program evolved out of our awareness of the wide-reaching influence of her photography and our interest in embodying the multidisciplinary spirit of the Walker. Today, a panel comprised of artists and practitioners with backgrounds in fiction writing, film, performance, and contemporary art will explore the multifaceted impact of Sherman's 30-year career. Before introducing our panel, I'd like to let you all know that today's event is being recorded and webcast live on our website, where you can find it at channel.walkerart.org. And when we reach the Q&A portion of the program, we ask that you raise your hand so that a microphone can be brought to you by one of our ushers in the aisles. This will allow the questions you ask to be picked up by the recording and heard by our online audiences. Lastly, I'd like to mention that immediately following the talk, our panel will be available for brief conversation in the lobby for those of you who would like to linger. And again, the galleries are open until 5. I'd also like to extend a very special thank you at this time to Susie Bialek, the Walker's Associate Curator of Public and Interpretive Programs, for all her stellar coordination of today's event. And now I'd like to introduce our panel, which I'll introduce in order of their appearance up here at the podium. And they will, of course, then all gather on the chairs to my right. Eva Respini is Associate Curator in the Department of Photography at the Museum of Modern Art, New York. She has organized numerous exhibitions on contemporary art and photography at MoMA, including Cindy Sherman, of course, Boris Mikhailov, Case History, 2011, Staging Action, Performance and Photography since 1960, and she's the author of several books, including Into the Sunset, Photography's Image of the American West, and Fashioning Fiction in Photography since 1990. A prominent figure in the new queer cinema, Tom Kalin is a filmmaker, writer, producer, and founding member of Grand Fury, an AIDS activist collective known for its provocative public art projects. Kalin's work ranges from experimental video installations to narrative feature films, including Swoon and Savage Grace. He collaborated on the screenplay for Cindy Sherman's 1997 feature, Office Killer, and produced such films as I Shot Andy Warhol and Go Fish. Kalin is a 2011 Guggenheim Fellow. Lynne Tillman is a novelist, short story writer, and critic whose work has appeared in numerous publications. A frequent collaborator with artists, Tillman has written a number of stories based on contemporary artworks. Her novel, No Lease on Life, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Fiction and a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. Lynne also happens to be a Guggenheim Fellow. And lastly, Malik Gaines is a performer in the collective My Barbarian, a troupe that has brought both playful theatricality and cultural critique to art institutions for more than 10 years. As a writer and curator, Gaines has explored the politics of expressivity and representation and organized exhibitions such as Fade, African American Artists in Los Angeles, and Made in LA 2012, the first Los Angeles biennial. And our moderator today is Walker Chief Curator Darsie Alexander, who has organized numerous exhibitions of contemporary art, most recently Dance Works 1, Merce Cunningham, Robert Rauschenberg from 2011, The Spectacular of Vernacular, 2011, Event Horizon from 2009, and Benches and Binoculars, 2009. Other important projects of hers dating pre-Walker include Franz West, To Build a House, You Start with the Roof, work from 1972 to 2008, and Slideshow, the first major exhibition to explore the history of projected slides in post-1965 art. In her role as chief curator here at the Walker, Darsie oversees not only the visual arts curatorial program, but those of film and video and performing arts. So she's well positioned to take on this lively bunch. We're delighted to welcome all these speakers here to the Walker today. And to start things off, please join me in welcoming Eva Respini. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here. I will quickly introduce Cindy Sherman's work to you, and then we will take a sprint through the exhibition. I'll take you through room by room for those of you who haven't had a chance yet to see the exhibition. Screen siren, clown, housewife, Renaissance maiden, fashion victim, society lady, fairy tale harridan. These are just some of the characters that Cindy Sherman has embodied for her own camera over the last 30 years that she's been making art. Sherman is her own model. She is also her own photographer, hairstylist, and wardrobe mistress. She works completely unassisted in her studio to create her characters for her own camera. While it's true that in all of these pictures, Sherman is her own model, it's worth saying that these are not self-portraits. Rather, Sherman's work is about the investigation of representation, the malleability of identity, in fact, the artifice of identity, and how photography is complicit in the manufacturing of identity today. Other key issues that Sherman has explored in her work that I'm sure we'll discuss in depth today include the conventions of portraiture, a critique of the norms of beauty and the fashion world, an investigation of feminine roles and stereotypes, as well as an examination of the monstrous and grotesque impulses in our contemporary culture. While performance, props, set styling are all key to the realization of her work, the fact is that the work remains a photograph, an image, and I want to always come back to that key point. And for me, I think in a world of YouTube, Facebook, reality TV, celebrity makeovers, Sherman is as contemporary as ever. And her work really responds to our contemporary cultural moment with this anxiety of the status of the self, which I believe is the hallmark of our contemporary culture. You might recognize this lady. She looks like someone, people say Madonna. So what I'll do now is quickly walk you through the exhibition as it exists upstairs at the Walker. This image comes from the presentation at the Museum of Modern Art. These are her photographic murals, which are among her most recent bodies of work presented in the exhibition. And when you walk into the galleries here at the Walker, it's the first thing you encounter. The exhibition is organized roughly chronologically. However, the first gallery brings together the very beginning and the very new. What you see are literally larger-than-life characters, and at MoMA they were presented in the foyer, the atrium, the outside of the gallery space, while in the Walker they're integrated with the other photographic works. But this really was a new step for Sherman in that she is creating work that responds to the architecture in which it's installed. So the characters and the backgrounds are scaled to the height of the ceilings, the way that the walls unfold. At the Walker, you'll see a beautiful frieze presentation with three characters. And of course, the characters change from presentation to presentation. And the characters are odd, I would say, bizarre. They seem to come from a sort of weird carnivalesque land that Cindy has created. And in fact, what sets them apart is the way in which she's made these characters. This is represents a new step for the artist. These are characters that are made with the aid of digital manipulation on the computer, which is something that Cindy has just begun working with. So she's photographed herself in costume against a green screen in her own studio. She's wearing no makeup. She's digitally inserted a background here, which looks like a kind of decorative toile wallpaper. And she's manipulated her face using Photoshop, perhaps narrowing the nose or puffing up the lips. And for me, this is very much a comment on how contemporary photography circulates in the mass media today. We all assume photographs are manipulated. We all assume photographs are fictions. And in fact, this has been at the very heart of her work from the very beginning. In the same gallery here at Walker, you'll see one of her earliest works from 1975, when she was just a student at Buffalo, and just beginning to come into her own as an artist. This is a piece that the artist has thought of as her first real piece. And you see here the very kind of building blocks of the career. You see a transformation of a kind of bespectacled, androgynous art student, which is in fact what perhaps what she looked like at the time. And you see here the process of transformation, literally the face being painted. And the photograph itself, it's a black and white photograph where the artist has hand-painted on the makeup, and you see the end of the process is this kind of cigarette-smoking vamp. And in fact, I like to show this because for me this is a kind of an analog Photoshop in the way in that she's applied makeup and hand-painting onto the photograph, I think in a very similar way that she has done with the mural, but just with technological means. Another very early work, which I think absolutely responds to or is a kind of precursor to the mural, is this great small-scale collage executed in 1976, a beautiful and rare work that I encourage all of you to inspect while in the galleries. But the career really starts with the Untitled film stills, her groundbreaking body of work from 1977 to 1980, 70 black and white photographs that are made to appear like film stills, made on the sets of films, the kind of stills that would have been used for publicity purposes. In fact, when you look at these stills, you think you know the movie that they come from. You think you see Hitchcock or Antonioni or Godard. But in fact, these are all fictional stills from films, and of course starring the artist herself in a variety of different guises and personas. What you'll see upstairs in the galleries are all 70 of the film stills gathered together, and I think what's important about gathering them all together and showing them as a unit is it really underscores how this is a body of work that reads almost like an encyclopedic roster of female types. These are stereotypes of female characters that we're all familiar with through film. We see the girl on the run, we see the city girl, we see the housewife, any number of characters that we instantly know their story because we've seen them on film. In 1980, Sherman started to work in color, and her second series in color are known as the Centerfolds. This is one picture from that series. 2 by 4 feet color photographs that are send-ups of men's erotic magazines, the genre of Centerfolds. But instead of young, fetching women, nude women, you have instead these women that are fully clothed and seem to be completely absorbed in their own world. This is a piece that, in fact, is in the Walker collection that was acquired in 1982 and is on view upstairs. And what's significant about this work is how color really plays an expressive role. While certainly the printed page is really the starting point for this body of work, you also see cinema here, and her use of colored gels, colored lights, and color itself to create expressive mood is just fantastic. In the mid-1980s, Sherman turned to more grotesque narratives and started to explore fairy tales as a source of inspiration for her characters. And I think these darker narratives are present in all of her work, especially the more recent work, which deals with manipulated and engineered bodies and faces. And I think you see the beginning of that fascination here, which really reaches its true heights in the late 1980s and early 1990s. In late 1980s, Sherman embarked on her history portrait series, which was executed between 1989 and 1990, which are taken old and master painting as inspiration. In this case, she has created old master paintings But like the film stills, these are not based on actual paintings. There's a few exceptions to this, but for the most part, they're her own versions of old master paintings. You might see glimpses of Caravaggio or Raphael and the Renaissance maidens and clergymen and others, aristocrats that she represents here. But they're really all just representations of an amalgamation of paintings, and done really with actually quite modest means. If you take an opportunity to really look at these, you'll see that her dresses and the costumes are just scraps of fabric that she had lying around. And here you really start to see this interest in exposing the artifice of the making of the picture through very over-the-top props and prosthetics, things that are very obvious as soon as you see the picture, but nonetheless are quite convincing. As I said, these narratives, darker narratives, exploring issues of the grotesque and the abject became her focus in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. This is a period when Sherman took herself out of her own photographs, and she's talked about this as a kind of challenge to herself. She wanted to know if she could make a successful photograph without being her own model. And while certainly she's not in the pictures anymore, you have this kind of stand-in for the artist's body with dolls, prosthetics that are, in the case here, composed to suggest a body. In the case of the sex pictures, which is a series from 1992, they're also very much a reaction to the time in which they were made, and specifically the debates about censorship in the arts. And this was Sherman's response to those debates, a very, I think, kind of aggressive response to those debates. Fashion has always been a source of inspiration for Sherman. Throughout her career, starting in 1983 and through the very present, she has made commissions for the fashion industry, for magazines such as Harper's Bazaar and Vogue, as well as for individual designers like Comme des Garçons. And these photographs that you see on the screen here are the results of those commissions. But of course, they don't look like your typical fashion pictures. These are what I call anti-fashion fashion pictures, and they really are a critique of the conventions and norms that the fashion industry puts forward, but really from within. And in fact, these are, in some cases, the top echelons of the fashion industry. In the case of the 2007-2008 picture, this is a commission from French Vogue where she's wearing head-to-toe Balenciaga. So you really have the top levels of the industry coming to Cindy to make these rather grotesque pictures. Starting in the early 2000s, Sherman returned to a more modest scale, and here you see her going back to her roots. These are headshots. These were conceived by the artist as headshots. She imagined actors that were posing for headshots in order to get an acting job. And in fact, the first time these were shown in LA, in Beverly Hills, around the time of the Oscars. And I think what you see here is a kind of aspiration to something, and perhaps even permeated with a sense of failure, something that really hasn't quite come to fruition. You see also women perhaps trying to deal with or trying to hang on to an ideal of beauty that perhaps has escaped them. And I think this is the beginning of a certain set of issues that she has explored more recently with great success and complexity. Her clown series from 2003 and 2004, I think, are reminiscent of her more mythical and carnivalesque characters, very over the top in terms of their theatricality. And here, for the first time, she is beginning to use digital technology to create her backgrounds, and I think to great nightmarish effect. These clowns are not about humor or happiness, but in fact, I think they're incredibly creepy, incredibly disturbing, and the way in which she's used here, color, makeup, posing, all contribute to that nightmarish effect. And finally, the last gallery you'll see in this exhibition is dedicated to the society portraits, a body of work that Sherman executed in 2008. In fact, they were presented for the first time in New York at her gallery in November 2009, which, if you think about the timing, it's almost as if she was presaging the financial collapse just a month earlier. And what you have here are larger-than-life women, one could say maybe of a certain age, presenting themselves for the viewer, for us, with a kind of immaculate facade, perhaps being helped by plastic surgery and other cosmetic alterations. And these pictures, I think, are among her most important body of work. I think the way that they deal with the use obsessed and celebrity culture is incredibly complex. I think they are vulgar, but I also think they're empathetic. I think that the layers of facade under scrutiny for the viewers, because they are presented at larger-than-life size, is just stunning. And I encourage all of you to spend a few minutes in that gallery with these women, because I think you'll come to empathize with them and love them as I have come to love them. And finally, just in the spirit of this interdisciplinary panel today, I thought I would share a few slides that have been inspirational to Cindy herself. Of course, film has always been a touchstone for the artist. She studied film in college, as well as visual arts and painting and other forms, but film has always been a huge influence, from the untitled film stills to the more recent. And here I have slides of just two films that are particular favorites. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is really one of her favorites. And then also just sort of mass and pop culture in general. Sherman was always looking at TV, magazines, movies, of course, as a source of inspiration. And one can imagine an advertising photo like this one below would have been the kind of images she absorbed as a child and as a young woman, and that she was reacting to in her work, and especially the work that deals with the stereotypes of feminine roles. Certainly art, of course, has been an inspiration to the artist, from Renaissance painting to 20th century towering figures. Of course, Rose C'est la Vie, I think, was a big inspiration to her, and Hans Bellmer, but also the feminist artists working in the 1970s and 1980s who were using their body as a political tool in their art was hugely influential on Sherman. I'd just like to close by saying that I think Sherman's influence is wide-reaching and far-reaching, and her work is extremely complex. I think one of the things that makes it so interesting is that it's accessible to many audiences. It's accessible to people that don't know anything about art, but yet those that are engaged in some of the most sophisticated debates about art and literature and film also are able to enjoy her work and keep enjoying it for years to come. And I think it's that quality that makes her so important and so influential to our current visual culture. Thank you so much.
Hi, I want to thank Darsie, Siri, and Susie for their incredible hospitality and organization. And this is a great time to be here, and Eva for her remarkable show. And apologies in advance for my slightly longish talk. It's a little longer than the 10 minutes I've been allotted. It's been 27 years since Cindy Sherman made this photograph. And though 1985 now seems distant, I've also been in enough automobiles to know that objects in the mirror are closer than they appear. The particular character of those days is tough to pin down, but it's important to try. Ronald Reagan was at the start of his second term. The stock market was booming. A fatal disease, initially known as gay cancer, had emerged as AIDS, though it would be another 2 years before Reagan would mention that word publicly. And 2 years before Black Tuesday, the 1987 stock market crash. In 1985, DNA was first used in a criminal case. South Africa dropped its ban on interracial marriage. Coca-Cola changed its formula and became New Coke. In the art world, theory was everywhere. I was a graduate student then at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. In a seminar with the influential critic, Craig Owens, we discussed Sherman's work by way of his essay From Work to Frame. Owens writes, "As Roland Barthes observed, the privileges reserved for the author in our society are distinctly masculine prerogatives. It is not surprising that Sherman's and Sherry Levine's works lack the melancholy with which Gerhard Richter and especially Paolini register the disappearance of the figure of the author." He goes on to quote Michel Foucault's What is an Author? Quote, "It is obviously insufficient to repeat empty slogans. The author has disappeared. God and man died a common death. Rather, we should re-examine the empty space left by the author's disappearance. We should await the fluid functions released by this disappearance." Cindy Sherman's gradual disappearance from her work and the fluid functions released by this disappearance have been much discussed and theorized. Were these images an allegory about AIDS? A commentary on feminism or on the theory of the death of the author? Both? Neither? Sherman's work is particularly receptive and resistant to anything as Sherman's work is particularly receptive and resistant to anything as tidy as a single theory. In her essay, Abstraction and Empathy, Joanna Burton articulates a complicated reading of Sherman's work. She writes, Sherman herself, as a presence, accretes over time and across images, and while she may patently avoid being the subject of her own work, it would be impossible to ignore that she, at the very least, has been haunting it for a very long time. There's a tug-of-war in Sherman's work between these layers of distance and presence, artifice and authenticity, and always ambiguity. At the same time, her images never seem completely impersonal. In this mysterious way, she really does haunt the work. From the very beginning, Sherman has avoided theoretical language and often spoken directly about feeling and experience. Quote, even though I've never actively thought of my work as feminist or as a political statement, certainly everything in it was drawn from my observation as a woman in this culture. And a part of that is a love-hate thing, being infatuated with makeup and glamour and detesting it at the same time. It comes from trying to look like a proper young lady or look as sexy or as beautiful as you can make yourself, and also feeling like a prisoner of that structure. Talking specifically about these abject works, phantasmagoria of vomit, blood, and shit, Sherman says, quote, some reviewers said I was totally deconstructing myself, chopping myself up by getting smaller and smaller and then finally disappearing. But the way I saw it was that I was nervous, that I was too dependent on myself, so I wanted to see if I could tell a story or to make an image without including myself. I've always been a bit suspicious of the narrative that stresses Cindy Sherman's normalcy and niceness. What I saw behind this art was an increasingly bold and uncompromising artist, a rebel who, after early success, dared collectors to, quote, hang this vomit over their couches. While I was looking at Cindy Sherman's so-called sex pictures, I was also reading Angela Carter's book, The Sadian Woman and the Ideology of Pornography. A highly original reconsideration of the work of the Marquis de Sade, Carter seeks to uncover the subversive potential in pornography. She writes, quote, pornography is the little orphan sister of the arts. Its functionalism renders it suspect, more applied art than fine art. When pornography abandons its quality of existential solitude and moves out of the kitsch area of timeless, placeless fantasy and into the real world, then it loses its function of safety valve. It begins to comment on real relations in the real world. Of course, I'm not simply saying that Sherman made pornographic work, though certainly it can be described as explicit. Clearly, she understands the power in reinventing the sexual stereotype and slur. In her hands, the seeds of subversion are planted within the very mechanism of conventional pornography. As Angela Carter writes, quote, sexual relations between men and women always render explicit the nature of social relationships and the society in which they take place, and, if described explicitly, will form a critique of those relations, even if that is not and never has been the intention of the pornographer. Carter goes on to propose two models of pornography. The first, outlined above, forms a critique indirectly. The second, and more rare, is a counter-practice of pornography, a, quote, moral pornography. She writes, the truth is that once pornography is labeled art or literature, it is stamped with the approval of an elitist culture, and many ordinary people will avoid it on principle out of fear of being bored. But the more the literary arts of plotting and characterization are used to shape the material of pornography, the more the pornographer himself is faced with the moral contradictions inherent in real sexual encounters. He will find himself in a dilemma, to opt for the world or to opt for the wet dream. Out of this dilemma, the moral pornographer might be born. The moral pornographer would be an artist who uses pornographic material as part of the acceptance of the logic of a world of absolute sexual license for all genders. A moral pornographer might use pornography as a critique of the current relations between the sexes. Such a pornographer would not be the enemy of women, but rather begin to penetrate to the heart of the contempt for women that distorts our culture even as he enters the realms of true obscenity as he describes it. Sherman's deft use of the figure, of event, story, and off-screen space charges these images with narrative. By using the tools of characterization and behavior, she makes her subject ever more complicated, human even, while they still exist as icons or myths. I first encountered these shocking tableaus at the height of the AIDS crisis. A rare skin cancer, Kaposi sarcoma, devastated people with AIDS, a visual sign of illness that conjured the abject, an image of walking death. Nicholas Nixon's photographs of people with AIDS from 1988 provoked angry reactions, and the activist collectives ACT UP and Grand Fury, of which I was a member, protested these images, which we felt were disempowering. In works like Our Kissing Doesn't Kill, Grand Fury sought to reclaim a healthy, sex-positive eroticism at the height of AIDS. Or in public projects like Welcome to America, we wanted to challenge the viewers in the street. As an artist, Sherman's example hinted at another path for me personally, one that engaged with volatile representation without taming it. My ability to make politically explicit work as part of an anonymous collective also freed me in my personal work to explore the unruly world of the unconscious. From these roots, my feature film Swoon was born. In 1987, I had the great pleasure of working as one of the writers of Cindy Sherman's feature film Office Killer. I was such a fan that when I first met Cindy, I tried hard not to lose my cool. But soon we were chatting away about our mutual love of horror director Dario Argento's expressionistic work. In the film, Carol Kane plays Doreen, a shy copy editor at Constant Consumer, a magazine on the verge of major downsizing. When a particularly unpleasant coworker dies accidentally, something within Doreen comes alive and sets off a murder spree. This unassuming woman collects bodies in the basement of the home she shares with her invalid mother, watching TV with them on the couch. As Eva writes in her catalog essay, the film resonates with much of the photographic work Sherman was making at the time, especially the colorful tableaus of vomit, body parts, and excrement. And her love of horror films is seen in the movie's campy melodrama, an underappreciated aspect of the work. In the film, the office is dominated by female characters wearing power suits and gaudy jewelry, smacking gum and being catty. The film's self-awareness and referentiality to her own work and to B movies echoes the strategies of Sherman's photographic work. There was a darker precedent for this notion of killing for company, a chilling real-world counterpart to Office Killer's obviously artificial narrative. I just want to catch up with myself. These are all stills from the film. So, on February 9th, 1983, Dennis Nielsen was arrested in his London home after human remains had been identified as the cause of blocked drains. Within days, he had confessed to 15 gruesome murders over a period of 4 years. His victims, all young homosexual men, had never been missed. To dispose of them, he chopped them into pieces and tried to flush them down the toilet. Of course, the Nielsen case is literally worlds away from Office Killer. Yet thinking about this troubling real-world case shed light on the screenplay. These drawings are part of a remarkable series of notebooks that Nielsen wrote while in prison. He writes of one of his victims, quote, "I wrapped him well before putting him under the floorboards. I took him up about 4 occasions in the next 2 weeks. It was cold down there and he was still very fresh. I would sit him in the other armchair next to me as I watched an evening's TV, drinking. I thought that his body and his skin were very beautiful, a sight that almost brought me to tears." And after his arrest, he wrote, "I am not full of self-pity, just amazed that all this could ever happen. I should feel like some two-headed monster. All I see in the mirror is me, just the same old, respectable, friendly, helpful, responsible me. I do not feel mentally ill. I have no headaches, pressures, or voices, nothing in my thoughts or actions to suggest insanity. Madness, as Quixote would say, is seeing life as it is and not as it should be. To seek treasure where there is only trash, to surrender dreams, to be what you are not." When I encountered these 2008, 2009 images of women of a certain age, they were particularly charged as I just finished my feature film, Savage Grace. Savage Grace tells the incredible true story of Barbara Daly Bakeland, an Irish Catholic girl from the wrong side of the tracks who married the dashing heir to the Bakelite fortune. After years of living in a hothouse environment of privilege and narcissism, Barbara develops an incestuous relationship with her son Tony, who eventually murders her. While making the film, I struggled with the narrative question, is it necessary for the audience to identify with the protagonist, or is empathy enough? It's a cliche to say that actors are brave when they play difficult roles. The truth is that adventurous, imaginative actors are drawn to high-wire challenges. I suppose the real bravery comes from the originality of mind not to judge these people, to try to bring empathy and compassion. Orson Welles once said, "Judge not lest ye bore the audience," and he was right. When talking to the press, Julianne Moore quoted Gustave Flaubert's maxim, and I know it sounds pretentious, but Julianne actually can quote Flaubert and not sound pretentious. She said, from Flaubert, "Be regular and orderly in your life like a bourgeois, so that you may be violent and original in your work." I think this quote could apply to Cindy as well. She was able to play this devastating role, but did not have to become Barbara Baekeland, nor identify with her. Empathy was enough. She brought compassionate humanity, and this makes her performance unforgettable and true. Joanna Burton discusses Sherman's work in the light of empathy. Quote, "One might argue that Sherman's return to her own work over the last decade enacts a kind of revenge on a culture that wills women to slowly disappear as they age or to render them desexualized but campy comic relief characters. But such a reading would merely replace the problematic figure of the girl with that of the crone. Yet to oppositely claim that these are pictures that somehow celebrate women in and of themselves or undo certain codes and conventions would also to enact another kind of bad faith, projecting a gentleness and generosity that all too easily imagined empathy onto images that do not necessarily produce either." Sherman herself, talking about the so-called Hollywood Hamptons pictures, said, quote, "But I empathize with these characters. Some of the most pitiful little characters in this series, my heart just goes out to them. I just adore them." When researching Savage Grace, I came across these images of Millicent Rogers. Rogers was a socialite, fashion icon, and art collector. She was the granddaughter of the Standard Oil tycoon Henry Huddleston Rogers and was notable for having been an early supporter of Native American art and jewelry. Later in life, she became an activist and was among the first celebrities to champion the cause of Native American civil rights. I find it a bit uncanny how much this imagery reverberates with Sherman's work. Finally, as a student and ultimately fan of Cindy Sherman's work, I continue to take inspiration from her example. It's an intriguing paradox that now, when I select stills from any of the films I've made, the example of Cindy's works provides a charged context. I'll leave you then with these images from Savage Grace and let Angela Carter have the last word. Myth deals in false universals to dull the pain of particular circumstances. The notion of the universality of human experience is a confidence trick, and the notion of the universality of female experience is a clever confidence trick. Thank you.
Sadly, I don't have any images to show. I write different forms of fiction, for instance, stories that respond to art or fictional essays and also criticism. I think about writing as art, like visual art, and often I make comparisons between art and writing. For example, what is space in writing? In college, I took studio art courses, painting and drawing courses, and have made films. So I have some experience not only in thinking from a visual perspective, but also in making art. But I probably think about art in large part with a writer's mind. It's a curious thing about works of art that immediately appeal to you. Works that seem to answer a question you didn't know you were asking, or if not asking, that unconsciously needed to be addressed and needed a response, though you didn't know you felt that. Something that needed representation, an inchoate thing, say. When I first saw Warhol in high school, it felt right to me, in place, with a place in the world. It seemed it should be there. It meant something to me, whoever I was. I had no doubt that it said something without words that I understood. A shock of recognition is what one experiences in the presence of art or a sentence or an experience that in one moment fuses and focuses consciousness, that seems to draw from variegated thoughts and images from the past and the present, from the dark well of unconsciousness, And suddenly, that object causes a person to see something anew, or see something for the first time that is old as it is new to them. It brings everything together, that shock of recognition. Cindy Sherman's work struck me like that. I suppose I first saw some of the film stills, I think that must be the case, at Metro Pictures, and that was in the late 70s or early 80s. So Cindy Sherman's art slid or leaped or landed in my life and into a place in the narrative of my life and the narrative of my thinking very quickly and easily. I bring narrative into my ways of seeing and understanding. It's how I think, and here's a gloss of recent history. After the assassinations of the 1960s, JFK's, Malcolm X's, Martin Luther King's, Robert Kennedy's, and others, after the liberatory movements, the panoply of civil rights for blacks, women, homosexuals, the rage and the joy of the 60s and its anthems and music, the Vietnam War and its polarizing effects, and into the 70s with the Nixon disgrace and debacle called Watergate. When the Vietnam War ended, Roe v. Wade was won and allowed for abortion rights. There followed, I think, along with Carter, a malaise, grave disillusionment. There followed a period of flatness, maybe disrupted by punk rock and the Loud Family on TV, say, but also a new consciousness was forming. During this time, I think, new sides were being formed. The polarities, in fact, that we saw in this recent presidential election stemmed, I believe, from the divisions and chasms first created in response to the Vietnam War. During this time, the 60s and into the mid-70s, really good art continued to be made, but then a new generation came along, which had imbibed and grown out of all of this, and they represented it in their art. In addition, a new kind of politics was beginning to emerge that embraced art criticism too. It was an art and a politics and a criticism that considered representation in ways never done before. That's a narrative or a part of it or a version which I'd suggest Sherman's work and her generation's work emerged from. She had different things to say. Now I'm going to quote from Gertrude Stein, from an essay which I think is probably the single most important essay that talks about newness in art and writing, called Composition as Explanation. Gertrude Stein wrote, "Nothing changes from generation to generation except the thing seen, and that makes composition." I'll repeat that. Nothing changes from generation to generation except the thing seen, and that makes composition. Here's another quote from her. No one thinks these things when they are making them, when they are creating what is the composition. Naturally, no one thinks. That is, no one formulates until what is to be formulated has been made. So Cindy Sherman's work formed because of this new composition, and I was in it too, and her approach sat inside a sensibility and worldview I recognized. She was playing with and revealing the illusory nature of photography, which others were doing too, for example, James Welling. But also Sherman had made me aware of and understand the impermeability and irresolute fiction of an individual's image. She also located something I didn't know had never been shown to me, how social and psychological the construction of an image is. But it goes further than this into the construction and meaning of character. I think Sherman makes characters and sets them in scenes, and very much in the way that I think of when I write a character or when I read great characters, great delineations of characters. And as a fiction writer, I write different characters for all sorts of reasons. In Sherman's work, there is a character shaped in terms of an individual model or a mode of existence. And I think to myself, I've seen that person before, Maybe she's an exaggeration, but then as Theodore Adorno said in his essay, Coming to Terms with the Past, today only exaggeration can be the medium of truth. Sherman also constructs the character of time, of a place, of a historical moment, a character of her time and in time. By the way, Stein, like Warhol, believed that no one was ahead of his or her time, that we were all of our time, like rockets and television, is what Warhol said. Cindy Sherman's work addresses both highly individualized characters who reside in settings that speak to their character and characters who speak to the time in which they live, the ethos, let's say. Another great artist who did that was Edith Wharton. Her characters were always part of their time and part of their setting. In other words, the social and the psychological, the political and the economic elements in her life were fused in something I call character. Here's a sentence from Wharton's novella, The Bunner Sisters, story about two poor women who run a little shop for trimmings, ribbons, and so on. Here's a quote. Seen thus in her sacramental black silk dress, a wisp of lace turned over the collar and fastened by a mosaic brooch, and her face smoothed into harmony with her apparel, Anne Eliza looked 10 years younger than behind the counter in the heat and the burden of the day. It would have been as difficult to guess her approximate age as that of the black silk, for she had the same worn and glossy aspect as her dress, but a faint tinge of pink still lingered on her cheekbones, like the reflection of sunset, which sometimes colors the west long after the day is over. Now think of that use of color in Sherman's work, and her attention to dress and the detail and the relationship she creates between the outer and the inner life of a person. Good writing wants a phrase or description, a simile or metaphor to function like that. The right word can cause a reader to feel, yes, that's it. That's exactly what it is. Consciousness is at the heart of character. Unconsciousness is its mysterious mover. In a series from Sherman's recent work, I call it Women in the West. I don't really know what the series is called, or Women in Western Landscapes. I note a very droll mind at work, and I'll propose she's doing two things, making two compositional moves. One is that she's displacing the Marlboro Man iconographically, and two, that she's literally changing the landscape, reshaping it. That is, she is peopling a traditionally male American landscape with females. She is, in both cases, unhinging or disengaging or re-engaging a usual visual coupling. This works subtly, though it appears as a bold image. Cindy's work is bold, but it also creeps into consciousness. That female or that woman, you don't associate her with that landscape. You haven't seen her there before. And then you ask yourself, why not? That's one of the questions you ask. In 1984, I co-directed a film called Committed about Frances Farmer. In it, there was a scene in which a father, a psychiatrist, and his American family, wife, son, daughter, sit around a dinner table. The 12-year-old daughter says, I want to be an anthropologist. This is meant to be the mid-1940s. And the father says something negative about Margaret Mead and how masculine she is. Now, when we showed that, people laughed. The word anthropologist is, for one, funny, I suppose, and that a father would say that you can't be an anthropologist, well, how ridiculous. No father would ever say that, would be the idea that the audiences from the mid-'80s when we were showing the film would say. But of course it's only funny because it sat outside representation. That kind of interaction had not been represented in any film I had ever seen, which is why I wrote it into the script. But it seemed odd because of that. So that's making a new composition, and that's what makes something new, being of her time and representing it. That's what Cindy Sherman has done and continues to do remarkably. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. I'm really honored to be here with this group of influential and illustrious artists and capable arts professionals, so thank you for the invitation. Please feel free to photograph this photograph. In her famous book On Photography, Susan Sontag calls for an ecology of images, a kind of conservation program to limit the dangerous proliferation of photographs. Was she kidding? This was the mid-70s, when consumers had cameras, but not like the cameras we've got now, hiding on or near all of us as I speak. This was when Cindy Sherman's photography as art began to proliferate, shifting a high-low axis with costumed representations. Sontag's chapter in Plato's Cave, a place she sees humankind continuing to dwell unregenerately, picks up some of Plato's own moralizing. In the cave, images are duplicitous, unreliable, mere flickering representations of true ideals. For Plato, representations are lies, set bad examples, should be regulated. Playing with the feminizing terms he uses to describe this duplicitousness, Luce Irigaray, in her Plato's Hystera, imagines his cave inverted, calling it a hystera theater, a womb-like black box where mimesis becomes mimicry, where reliable axes flip and bend, and in this disorientation, a play of images might reveal more about the nature of representation than light, truth, and meaning ever will. The Hystera theater is a way into what the theater scholar Ellen Diamond calls a feminist mimesis, meaning a mode of representation that is critical of the phallic order of language, law, and the rest. A true mimic, Cindy Sherman continues to dwell unregenerately in one cave or another. Me. I don't know what to say about Cindy Sherman. I have nothing to add. This is going to be a disaster. Boyfriend Alex. Why don't you talk about how her show was up at SF MoMA when we did our performance there, and how it brought a large audience into the museum, some of whom saw the show and then stayed for the performance. Cindy Sherman helped introduce the idea of performance into the museum. Me, okay. Nina Simone's Four Women. Second woman. My skin is tan. My hair is fine. My hips invite you, Daddy. My mouth is like wine. Whose little girl am I? I'm yours if you have money to buy. What do they call me? My name is Sweet Thing. My name is Sweet Thing, Sweet Thing. Me, I still don't know what I'm going to say at the Cindy Sherman panel. Alex. When we talked about her in my class, the students and I decided she's the art world Meryl Streep. It's weird to see pictures of her without makeup on. Talk about costume and makeup. Me, paraphrasing. But all of my investment in those relates to constructing a persona where a subject position is impossible. An example, Josephine Baker broke down the prohibitions of race and gender with costumed performance. She wore the banana skirt. She wore the tuxedo with tails and top hat. She wore a clown suit. In one of her last performances, she came on stage at 65 riding a Harley and wearing a white beaded motorcycle outfit. At the March on Washington, she spoke briefly, wearing a military uniform adorned with all of the medals she had been given by France for supporting the resistance during the war. Back in 26, after her breakthrough performance in Paris, a critic wrote, "Is this a man? Is this a woman? Her lips are painted black. Her skin is the color of banana. Her hair, already short, is stuck to her head as if made of caviar. Her voice is high-pitched. She shakes continually, and her body slithers like a snake. The sounds of the orchestra seem to come from her. Is she horrible? Is she ravishing? Is she black? Is she white? Nobody knows for sure. There is no time to know. She returns as she left, quick as a one-step dance. She is not a woman, she is not a dancer, she is something extravagant and passing, just like the music." Of course, she was a woman, a mixed-race African-American from Missouri, who got a lot more out of her stage persona than she would have out of her marginal origins. The costumes, the makeup, the legend all point back to this persona. They help construct it, a magical stage presence around which the representations circulate. And so my difficulty in thinking about Sherman's work in the terms that I'm familiar with, the terms I've used to discuss Baker or Nina Simone or Sylvester, or even the ways we use costume and makeup in My Barbarian performances, my difficulty with Sherman's work is that the representations don't necessarily point back to a central persona. They don't prop up an author or a diva, but rather they float out there, unattached, and that central place where identity might be constructed is actually totally empty, evacuated. Here's what Douglas Crimp says in The Photographic Activity of Postmodernism, which appeared in October, Volume 15, Winter 1980. Sherman's photographs are all self-portraits in which she appears in the disguise enacting a drama whose particulars are withheld. This ambiguity of narrative parallels the ambiguity of the self that is both actor in the narrative and creator of it. For though Sherman is literally self-created in these works, she is understood as contingent upon the possibilities provided by the culture in which Sherman participates, not by some inner impulse. As such, her photographs reverse the terms of art and autobiography. They use art not to reveal the artist's true self, but to show the self as an imaginary construct. There is no real Cindy Sherman in these photographs. There are only the guises she assumes, and she does not create these guises, she simply chooses them in the way any of us do. The pose of authorship is dispensed with not only through the mechanical means of making the image, but through the effacement of any continuous, essential persona or even recognizable visage in the scenes depicted. Crimp's dynamic here is a postmodern turn, pivoting away from the authority of modernism. Against the pluralism of originals, I want to speak of the plurality of copies, he says. The picture's generation he discusses takes up what modernism had repressed, representation. While these artists used representation as a place to dispense with a traditional sense of originality, authority, and presence, many artists of color have noted since the impossibility of giving up things you've never had. But I don't want to lead myself too far down that path here. I recently walked into an opening of a posthumous show of a Harlem photographer and encountered a high-level African-American curator breaking bad news to a photography collector. Original prints don't matter anymore. Postmodernism has been a self-fulfilling prophecy. Let's leave photography aside and end with performance, my practice, the location of mimesis and mimicry, the place where Baker et al. Acted themselves out, and the art world pathway through which Crimp moves from the presences of the 70s to the absences of the 80s. What Sherman's works show on their surface, particularly when assembled like they are here, is the power of the transforming body. Through theatrical techniques, one can become anyone. Critically, the difference between, say, a clown and an heiress reveals the constructedness of class as a series of genres. While the central persona has abandoned these image performances, their manifold selves are just as revealing, and dare I say present, as any one self. As in Irigaray's theater, the axis of presence and absence flips around, disorients. So let's conclude by singing together and see how present it feels. I'm every woman. Join me, please. I'm every woman. Then a change. I'm every woman. Yes, good, louder. I'm every woman. Then back. I'm every woman. A little louder. I'm every woman. I'm every woman. One more. I'm every woman. Very nice, thank you.
That's a little hard to beat. I can say I went into this talk with my very detailed questions, which I thought were expressive of the salient themes of Sherman's work, but I see I've completely re-scripted my follow-up because the various thoughts and provocations that all of you have introduced have been so compelling. I do want to jump to a slide, sort of springing off of your last, your performance and some of your observations, but I can't find my clicker. Okay, so I guess I'm going to do this vocally. All right, so can you fast forward? Next slide. All right, next one. Next one. Okay. You, Lynne, were talking about the contemporaneity of Sherman's work, of being in the lived moment. And coming out of a week where we've had an election, a really important election, and I think one that introduced a lot of surfaced a lot of themes around the disparity of wealth, really maybe more than any other election. And it's really hard to look at Sherman's work without thinking of issues related to class. And Tom, you really spoke to that when you were talking about Savage Grace and the Julianne Moore character. And I wonder if we might start just by thinking a little bit about that issue of class, because it seems to be both something that is very much embodied in her most contemporary work, and is perhaps not something that often gets discussed. And Eva, maybe you have some thoughts to introduce the conversation.
Sure. Even though I went through great pains to saying that these are not self-portraits, I do think there's something incredibly personal about this body of work and worth mentioning, in that Cindy perhaps could be considered the same class as these women. She has risen to a certain stature within the art world and has done very well for herself. And I think it's maybe something she doesn't like to talk about, and as a result, many critics don't like to talk about. But I think there's something intensely personal for her, depicting these women that perhaps could be women that are her friends or her collectors, or women that she might encounter within her daily life, in her circles. And for me, that's an incredibly potent idea to think about in relationship to Cindy's work, because it does bring it to a much more personal level than I think any of the other bodies of work to date.
Do you think, you've often talked about the difference between different sorts of characters that she made vis-a-vis the personal, the very individualistic, and the sort of archetypes that are part of her practice? Can you differentiate a little bit between, when you talk about the personal versus a sort of archetypal character that Sherman embodies?
Sure. I actually think these are a good example, and a lot of people say this. They say, I know that woman. I have seen her, I've met her, maybe you had lunch with her, and certainly I've met these women. And I think you may not have that reaction, for example, when you look at the Untitled film stills. You know that character. You know the girl on the run. So for me, there is a kind of individual quality that these women have. And I think Cindy is so precise in her observations. The jewelry, the hair, the makeup, the gesture, just so. So this actually feels like these women exist in the world. They're somewhere out there. Whereas I think for me, the film stills work as types, and they represent a certain kind of type that we all know and we're all familiar with. But they work, for me, they function on very different levels.
I after listening to Malik's talk, I think one of the things that becomes very obvious is that she's also dealing with images of white people, and in a sense, these are critiques of the position of white people or white privilege, also. So it's the way in which class and race fuse. I think she has not chosen yet to represent black women, African American women, Dominican women, and maybe she will do that at some point. And I think that I think that's a good distinction to make between the character in the film stills and what seems to be, I think, much more psychological portraits here.
I was thinking, it's such an unlikely reference, but one of the things I was remembering about this is this incredible quote from Elia Kazan, who basically says that the job of the director is basically to turn psychology into behavior. And I think it's the most concise way to talk about what Cindy does, because I actually think that these things are really about behavior. The work is so, and that because of that, they have a kind of psychological astuteness. That behavior and gesture is being reduced down to its kind of essence, but and exactly because they're drawn from life, they have that quality. She's also I think that's what's interesting about classes, because she's really implicated in the work itself. I mean, she implicates herself in the work. She's always been implicated in the work, but in this work, and in the scale, the presentation, and all of those things about it, I think makes them really powerful.
I don't know. They're not speaking subjects, and even in the film stills, there's always this implication of narrative, that they're sort of trapped in the middle of some generic dynamic. And with portraiture, it's very different. And I think that's part of what I feel is a kind of ambiguity you talked about, and your essay talk about her accepting and rejecting feminism simultaneously, or this kind of implication of the self while critiquing the class. And there's sort of an ambivalence there that I think this kind of mute subject that stares at you, you can read a lot into it. You can read a lot of different things into it. So, I mean, that's a kind of powerful critical place to be able to say 10 things at once. But it also means that these aren't necessarily activist critiques against the elite class. They fold into each other, the positions.
Well, think about Warhol's portraits at some point in the early 80s when he started to make celebrity portraits or portraits that were commissioned by very wealthy people, but at the same time he did the what was it called? 10 important Jews or something.
Something like that.
Yeah, something like that. But the way in which the image was done was not different,
Yeah, I mean, I just want to start with and look at this slide for a minute, because it does have a variety of different characters Sherman playing various characters. Yet, as everyone has suggested, the characters are white women. And the psychological dimension to the work, I think, comes out not just in the kind of way that she's constructed what can be often quite unsettling images of women kind of on the run or in a vulnerable position. It's also the psychology of their impact on viewers. And I think, maybe, Eva, you could say a few words about sort of what Cindy's own thinking is about the effect of her work, because I know that sort of loop around how the work gets interpreted, of course, always gets filtered back to the artist, to you all. And I guess I'm interested both in sort of how that filter then influences you when you're thinking about your work, but also just this question of the psychological effect of the work in a way, because it can be quite potent. Even walking through the galleries, you can see people's reaction. They're just completely engrossed. What is it about the psychology that is... It's many different things, but I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
Well, I think that's part of what makes the work so great, but I think, Tom, you addressed this in your talk, in that Cindy really comes from a place of the gut. She doesn't start with theory, even though her work has been theorized by, the luminaries in the field and theorized very well, but she doesn't come from that place. She comes from observation, her own interests, and I think you see that as an effect in the work, that it comes from this very personal place. However, she's not immune to the readings that come back to her. A lot of the grotesque work, where she's removed herself from the pictures, is in fact a reaction to her success in the collector's world, where people really were just dying to buy pictures and hang them in their homes. And as soon as she made something like this, they weren't quite so keen on it, as you pointed out, Tom. So, and I think that's a case where she has then reacted very much to how her work has been received, whatever the intention was.
I also think that these rather than saying that the pictures have a psychological meaning or meanings, it's the investment of the viewer, the spectator, who makes those meanings. And in a way, as an artist, as a writer, for instance, I try to leave as much space as I can for a reader to imagine her or his own version of this story. And I think one of the things that's very disruptive about Cindy's work is when you stand in front of it, it's not telling you how to look at it. It really is much more open-ended, and you look at this and you make a relationship to the image. And it could be all sorts of things, and it may be frightening, or it may be comfortable, or something else. And so in that sense, you are creating that picture psychologically.
What I think so interesting about it's like rereading this, all that 80s stuff about death of the author and birth of the viewer and all that. What it never, and at the time it seemed completely authentic and three-dimensional, and explained everything about the work. And what it doesn't really explain at all to me is this thing that was in Joanna Burton's article, this just idea of how she haunts the work. And this palpable sense that there's a kind of, I can't quantify it, I can't describe it through language, but a feeling in the work about the collision between what it's like to be in the world as a person, actually, and a kind of intense sense of empathy and identification in a way that is so something very personal, but that's being rendered in a kind of cool or slightly abstracted way that I think gives it power and it creates an intense mystery around it, because you're aware of, because I feel fully activated as a viewer when I look at the work, but I'm also aware as I've accreted and looked at that work over time about a kind of, a very wily, nimble idea about sort of authorship and about what she's saying about these characters. Old thing seen, the other explanation of the idea of the death of the author always seemed like only half the story.
Well, I don't think that Bart meant. I don't think that Bart meant the death of the author in a literal,
Yes.
in a literal or even figurative way. I think that what he was talking about was authorship, in the sense of the grand narrative, that was being disrupted. And when Joanna Burton uses the idea of haunting, I can go that far, but that's about as far as I can go, because I don't want to read these images or any art.
Yes, that's
through,
autobiography.
And so haunting that's an interesting kind of space between this assertion of the artist's identity versus the artist isn't there at all.
Yeah.
That's an interesting place, I think.
But can we talk quickly about cases in which the artist isn't there at all? Because I think if you're talking about haunting, in a way you're talking also about the mise en scène, the feeling of a place. And I wonder, Tom, if you could just speak to the incredible way in which she constructs these environments. And she is so meticulous in every facet of makeup, even when there's no face to paint. But the way that the scenes are composed, color, texture, garmentry. Can you talk a little bit about your own experience because obviously you work in that kind of composition as well.
Yeah, I think that, it's what I found really moving about her talking about the turn in the work from, and when people are saying this is about sort of deconstructing yourself and the rest, and she said, well, no, actually, in part was just trying to figure out if I could tell a story without me in it, which I relate to, and the kind of understanding of the formal properties of using off-screen space as a narrative device and about what you do not see is one of the really powerful things in both photography and filmmaking. That is very is strongly in common. Also comes out of a very particular idea of conjuring which is very consistent in her work, conjuring a much bigger world through very slim means. So even in the society work, there's a kind of, at this stage of her work, Cindy could be hiring, couturiers to dress her and have a set built entirely, but it's all kind of scotch taped together a little bit. And the seams of it are really clear, and that hovering on the edge of something that's really solidly made and is about to fall apart at any minute is what gives the work total power, because it's being done with the least amount of gestures possible in a way. It's a thing, and it's funny because I think of this work at the time, I actually did kind of have a visceral reaction to this work when it first came out, and the sex work especially I did. Now I have a different reaction to it, I come to it from a different lens because I have the benefit of looking at the body of work over time, I think.
But did you feel, I'm just curious, when she took herself out of the work, supposedly. It seemed to me that I was more aware of her presence than I'd ever been.
For sure. No, it's a paradox. It's a
Yes.
paradox exactly what trying to get at of the idea of haunting, the same being there and not there, which is, I think,
But
really
that
powerful.
decision to take herself out of the work spoke so loudly. It was very different from watching somebody create a structure, whether it was Hans Bellmer's, poupée, or it was a very strange. Did you feel that way, Eva?
Yeah, and certainly even though she's out of it, for example, in this picture, she's still in it,
Yeah,
in the reflection in the glasses, and then also there's a number of them where she's, really hovering in the background, that pimply butt that you showed also, she's there, and a number of the other ones. So, but even with the sex pictures, the dolls, for me, are a stand-in, really for her own body, even if they're hybrids or, not quite human. There is, in many cases, always a figure there as a stand-in.
Mm-hmm.
We never talk about, it's funny, that work coincides, the sex work coincides exactly with Silence of the Lambs. Exactly, actually. And so the issues of, which I don't think is intentional at all, but it's one of the reference points I have, not just the NEA and all the controversial representation, but the hermaphroditic figure that is at the heart of Silence of the Lambs.
Malik, I want to ask you a question, because I think that there is such an interesting connection to performance history that you evoked. And often Sherman is written, certainly within contemporary art broadly, but in particular the history of photography, she operates and has a very strong presence. And I wonder if you could maybe elaborate on some of the things you were saying about Sherman vis-a-vis Josephine Baker, and just what would a history of performance look like, if Sherman were a key figure in it.
That's really interesting because the work really operates at an art object level in its most sort of perfect way. But I think it's this kind of integration of performance, of cinema, of all of these kinds of competing disciplines into the work that, first of all, makes it so appealing and engaging and just fun to encounter. But also one of the things that was historically an intervention of some kind. And, when I think about haunting, for example, I can't help thinking it's, for me, as someone who learned about Cindy Sherman in college in mid-90s, after what's haunting the work often is this tremendous career, this is a big artist that we all know about. So that's an achievement in the kind of lineage where then performance, which was, totally outside of the museum and then was inside the museum against the museum's will through minimalism and ideas about theatricality, and then sort of slowly through the 70s became about this kind of activated viewer being realized through live action. And then these things all sort of combine and coalesce in this work. And I don't think of it as performance exactly. I think of somebody like Eleanor Antin, a 70s figure who also dressed up as characters and also took photos of these characters. And but there's so much stuff in between. She's talking all the time about it. She has scripts. She has plays that you can see. There's journals she wrote about what it was like to be the character. There's all this kind of meta narrative. And again, these are these really refined, really specific, still mute images. And so I think performance is being used in a really productive and a way that sort of transformed the field for a lot of people. But I don't think of it as performance exactly. I wonder what she says about that.
I think she would agree, and I actually think you made an excellent point in that, with the exception of that first image that I called her first real work that you showed, your illegal picture of it.
Obviously, I like that one.
That's, what she really does is it boils it down to one single image. The process is really never revealed. It's a private ritual that occurs in her studio without an audience and without assistance. She's doing her own makeup. She's, doing the shutter release. And I think that's a huge distinction from someone like Eleanor Antin or even, Hannah Wilke, who was also making performances for the camera. but there was all this other stuff outside of that, outside of the image that informed it in a way that Cindy, really cuts all of that out so that it really comes back to the image always.
And Carolee Schneemann, I was thinking about, and I think it's really a rejection of that way of representing the female body. She's on about something very, very different, I think, in these
And thus
images.
part of the controversy of the work itself, in terms of the generational reception of it or the discussion of it, I think, because it was like and not like, and the ways it was not like, because, I think that we were talking before about the Centerfolds and the way that work got attacked at the time it was made, which I find sort of
I
amazing.
can't remember. How did the Centerfold work get attacked?
Martha Rossler pretty famously wrote an essay criticizing the work and talking about it sort of in terms of the male gaze and a very sort of strict feminist reading of it, and talking about sort of the idea of, I forget the title of that essay, but it's about sort of the limits of appropriation as a strategy. I can't remember the name of that essay. Do you remember it? Anyways, and they were commissioned originally by Ingrid Tichy for Art Forum and rejected because they were considered to be neither here nor there in a way. And I just find that interesting about how she's building. There's a direct relation to Wilkie or Anton, but also there's a break for sure. And for some people, that break was really, really powerful. As somebody kind of coming of age in the early 80s, I felt like I had to kind of take sides around. And then the biggest thing, beyond being a fan, was this example that you could actually make work out of a really contradictory place, attraction and repulsion in equal measure, and making work honestly saying, I am attracted and I am disgusted by, and trusting the audience enough to go on the journey of that, instead of a purely kind of didactic impulse.
Well, I do want to say that there are other feminists. I mean, the feminist critique of Martha Rossler might be different from the feminist critique of somebody else working then, and I think that's really important to remember, too.
Yeah, I mean, do you, those of you who are engaged in teaching, and I guess this would be a question maybe for the audience to think about too, because I'm sure we have a lot of students and teachers. It would be interesting to know a little, to think about how this work is resonating with this generation, because there are so many different sort of generational shifts around feminism as a subject, around the different readings of Sherman's work, and I just wonder what your experience has been teaching this work or talking this work, if at all, in the classroom with students today, and how is it resonating with that a younger generation? Because this is all.
You see so many there's, I don't know, Katie Grannon or Dana Hoey, or there's a number of artists who've worked photographically, female artists who are, I don't know, maybe 20 years younger, roughly, than Cindy, whose work clearly is building or is in direct conversation with Cindy's work.
Or Gregory Crutzen.
Yeah.
There's been a generation that has come that's building on it. But I think, as Malik said, there's a way in which it's already received, and that's very different. And Eva, you came into Cindy's work very differently from.
Yeah, I have a confession to make. The earliest picture in the show was made the year I was born. So, I literally don't know a world without Cindy Sherman. And maybe this sort of what you were talking about, Malik, about knowing the work in college and primarily through reproduction first, I think does bring a different reading to it. And, in terms of thinking about younger artists, I think of someone like Ryan Trecarton, who is a generation even younger than Dana Hoey or Katie Grannon, or Caleb Lindsay. And, if you think about their kind of performative or video works, it's always mediated. They have characters, they have performances, but it's always mediated. And in a way, I find, that's a sort of like third generation, I think, but you see Cindy's influence in that work. And in a way, that's the way I found myself getting into the work and my way in.
Well, one of the things that's interesting about Cindy's work is in fact she doesn't really have much to say about it. I mean, she's pretty mute when it comes to offering up an explanation. And since you're all artists in different ways, curators are artists too, in their own sense. I just wonder if you could respond to that. What are the pluses and minuses of explanation when it comes to your own work? Because the fact of her silence is now almost part of Cindy's canon. And I just wanted to throw that out there.
I envy it. I actually think, I have to say though, to be a slight counter note, I actually find Cindy to be one of the most lucid, jargon-free, cutting through the crapness, talking around her work. I also find her to be wily as a fox, so I don't think it's, I don't know. I think she understands what she's doing, and thus the riddle. Like the talking about the work is a weird corollary to the work itself somehow. But I've never felt, and I have no reason to say this, but I've never felt that was, in another artist I might feel that was a strategy and a kind of way to make the work seem richer or more mysterious or whatever, but it has always seemed authentic to me, and always seemed, because when she does speak about the work, it seems spontaneous and true. I get in trouble I mean, I make, Savage Grace required, I think, because of the nature of a film festival and how you screen a movie, you have to stand in front of an audience afterwards and explain, and that movie provoked enormous hostility, so I had to be charming and funny and try to make the audience be okay with the movie I just made, which part of me hated, frankly, because you don't want to have to create that.
I think she is. There's that silence you can think of as sort of the silence of the analyst, listening to.
Nodding.
No, I think she is. I think she's very wise, actually, in doing that. The more books I have come out, and the more pieces, the less I want to say about them, the less I want to determine or control any kind of reading. Because frankly, I do really believe that it really starts with the reader and the viewer. You can say, I mean, I say this to my students, I say, you can't put meaning into your stories. That's just not how it works. You write what you write, and if there's any meaning in it, it comes when it circulates and other people read it. You can't determine the meaning. And I think she knows that.
And of course, it depends on what kind of work you're making. And in this case, it really serves the work to keep that central space free of a kind of over-determining persona who has too much to say about it, because exactly what both of you were just saying. In some sense, I wonder, has mysteriousness allowed her to become a kind of a woman artist as famous as only men had been up until that point, and then the fantasy of the artist as the genius who doesn't know how to talk, and that appeals to certain sectors, and all of that. I wonder, but I don't know her, and so you're saying that it's not a strategy. It's
When I compare her to Warhol, when you think of the way Warhol spoke about the work in that kind of monosyllabic, very funny, very witty, yes, no, yes, no, it's worlds apart, And I have no knowledge. It could utterly be calculated, but it's an instinctive thing of the quality of the writing itself and a consistency of her voice. Because in prepping this, I read a lot of stuff again. And I was amazed that even when she contradicts, because later I didn't choose to do this, but she actually says, okay, I'm feminist, in an interview actually in your catalog, which I chose not to include, but I want to just make the point that there are contradictions, and even within those contradictions, there seems to be a kind of very powerfully consistent voice.
Well, sometimes it's not a contradiction, but an evolution, or she begins, we all begin to see ourselves differently, or better or worse, or both.
And also, it wasn't always like this. Cindy, in fact, there's an anecdote where the last public talk she gave, I think, was in the early 80s, right after the Centerfolds. There was a class from SVA, the School of Visual Arts in New York, that came to her show, the Centerfolds, and she gave a talk, and she was viciously attacked. I mean, probably for the reasons you were outlining, and that was the last time she spoke publicly. So I don't think this was always a strategy. I agree with you. I don't think it's calculated. But the work is all untitled for that very reason, and she doesn't give titles to the series, even though we all call them, the same names. And even the numbers, Untitled number 463, that number just comes from her gallery. It's an inventory number. So I think, it's all of that goes towards, I think when she's making the work, that in the end, she likes to release it into the world, and it really has its own life.
Okay, speaking of releasing out into the world, I think we should maybe shift gears and take questions from the audience for the next 10 or so minutes. There is There are 2 staff members who have microphones, so if you want to ask a question, please wait for the mic to come to you. We are recording this for the Walker Channel. Questions?
Nope. Is this on? Okay, hi. I've got a question about what she came out of. I mean, the first photograph that's, I guess, is considered the first one is 1975. So punk rock, she's in Buffalo, right? So she's probably aware punk rock is just starting up in New York City. There's the idea of dressing up and becoming somebody. I'm wondering about what other influences did she have in her time when she started? Because it seems like she had almost a complete, looking back now, it's amazing how complete her vision of what she wanted to do was. She's been so consistent through the decades. What was it that helped form that? I think of Richard Prince, at the same time, another place, another time, but very sort of similar vibe in a way.
Well, when she was in Buffalo, it was very formative for her. She initially was studying painting, and in fact, she was a very good photorealistic painter, but then switched to photography. But she was among a group of artists that included Robert Longo and Charlie Clough, and part of a non-for-profit space called Hall Walls that had a lot of different artists coming through for speaking engagements, exhibitions, performances, people as diverse as Richard Serra and Hannah Wilke, and that made a huge, huge impression on her. She was also very much influenced by film. When she was in Buffalo, she actually worked briefly for Paul Scherritz, the filmmaker. But this thing about the dressing up goes back to childhood, the way I think it does for many people. She often dressed up. She liked to dress up. It's something she continued to do as a young woman. In fact, she was doing that in college just for fun, going to parties as a pregnant lady or as an old lady. And her boyfriend at the time, Robert Longo, encouraged her to think about making work that might incorporate this. But of course, she's steeped in thinking about performance, conceptual art practices, and it starts to ferment. And then she moves to New York in 1977. In the summer of Sam, she falls in with an artistic community that includes musicians, filmmakers, artists, and is part of a kind of general, what you might now call sort of postmodern circle of people, including Richard Prince, Barbara Kruger, Laurie Simmons, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that circle and those compatriots all fueled what was something she, had maybe done from childhood, but the way in which it became articulated in her work was very much coming out of a generation of artists that were thinking about similar issues, although maybe articulating them in different ways.
Yeah, particularly around representations of women. I mean that's just a very strong constant in her work, obviously. Yep. Next. Any more questions?
Hello. I'm interested in the limits of the strategy of appropriation that someone mentioned in her work. It's interesting who is not represented, I suppose, in the limits of maybe from her observational experience that Eva mentioned informed her work in terms of being focused on high society. I guess reading this as someone of a younger generation post-economic collapse, it's kind of interesting to think about who isn't there at the same time, or who maybe she can't be, along with being able to be everyone and just playing with the limits of the range of identity and stereotype.
One of the things that I didn't really know, one body of work I didn't know prepping this thing as well, were the Bus Riders series, which are, you'd know better than I, but I don't know, it's 76, 77, they're still done in Buffalo, and that's, as far as I know, those are the only works where people of color appear. Yeah. Which I found interesting. I actually don't find those works cartoonish at all, and I find them to have the same kind of empathy the rest of her work did, and I wondered about what it was she found out in making that work that either caused her to not continue at the direction, or what's at the core of that.
I think the question of who is allowed to represent whom is one that's particularly pernicious. In 1992, I published a novel, my third novel, called Cast in Doubt, and it was my response to the idea that you can only write from your so-called subject position, whatever that is, which is, of course, constructed. So I wrote a novel in the first person from the point of view of a 65-year-old gay man, and I set it in 1974. And that was part of my desire to break through that. And it's interesting, the responses that it got and didn't get. And I will continue to do that. I'm trying to do that more and more in terms of representation. And it's a tricky thing. But you have to, in a way, I'm going to say something very strong, you have to I think, contend with the idea you might be called a racist or a sexist or whatever if you don't get it right from somebody's point of view. And what that means, after a while, I don't know. And you can't talk about the artist's attention. I don't know what you can talk about in relationship to it. But I certainly think that white writers in America really need to challenge themselves a little bit more.
I'm not sure what to say about this exactly, but I mean, obviously, from the page to being the body has a whole sort of shift. And thinking about this, though she stretches her range of characters across this extraordinary breadth, there's a certain kind of limit to what possibly her real body can authoritatively represent. And I mean, the piece in the show where she's like a Dionysus and she has kind of a muscular arm made out of makeup it's really stands out to me,
You know how she did that?
How?
So she had her arm like this, and then she had the arm underneath with the fist pushing the muscle so that the muscle would appear larger, and then shading the makeup, because precisely that. In fact,
The same way drag queens make a
there
bust
you go.
line.
Exactly. But
Well, there's a lot of drag in this work.
A female impersonator.
Absolutely, exactly.
Which is amazing. So that's a good question that has a lot of answers, I think.
I would like to just make a comment. I mean, in the absence of self, how intriguing. I mean, and to have an invitation, which I consider that to be, I mean, I stand in awe thinking about, and here we have an unadulterated, pristine invitation for us to participate in the images that she's created without having to deal with adulteration with ego. That we live in a world so infused with ego and persona that the idea that you could get an invitation like this is really a rare opportunity that is really inspiring. And it's just the thought of it, to be invited to participate in this without having the self, the ego infused in it to the point where it clouds your ability to see your own relationship to the work of art, is really amazing.
Thank you. Maybe one more?
Why do you think Cindy Sherman was the woman of her time that became like one of the most popular contemporary female photographers, and not someone else? Why do you think it was her specifically?
Wow, who's going to take that one?
If I knew how to become the most popular contemporary person of my time, I might try it. It's a good question.
There are other, I think, formidable artists and female artists and photographers from that time also. But I think she responded to the zeitgeist, let's say, to put it in that rather prosaic way. I think that she answered a question and fulfilled a kind of desire we didn't know that we needed, and created something that helped us understand where we were also. I think she just really, her work just did suddenly speak very strongly.
and continues to do so.
And continues to do so. Yeah.
Well, there's incredible surface seduction, too. It's not, I mean, just looking at that work is really amazing. And part of it is when you're encountering Sherman herself, to sort of suss out the line between what is her physical anatomy and what is, just as you were describing, I was pretty sure that was her arm, but I wasn't entirely. And then those moments when her actual eyebrow and her painted on eyebrow don't kind of align, that's when it gets really draggy and vampy. But I mean, the actual pleasure of looking at that work, which is so textured, her sense of color. I mean, I sound like such a formalist here when it's clearly so conceptually rich, and I hope that's something that we've drawn out. But it's beautiful to look at.
I think there's one other thing. You're extremely young, but those of us who are not as young might remember what there was before, and how different her work is from what was before. That's really, if you think of the conceptual work of the mid to late 60s, minimalism and so on, or the work by, I don't know, Ad Reinhardt and so on. I mean, the closest would be Warhol, I think. But you have to, it was just, again, the shock of the new. There was something she was doing that hadn't been done, and other people too.
Okay, well, I think we're just about at time. Thank you all so much for coming out today. Appreciate having you.